Hello and welcome back. I'm Karen Sullivan of Soul Symbols, and this is our Friday contemplation. On Mondays, I look at the wider sky, the broad view and the larger pattern, and that archetypal web moving through our collective field. And on Fridays, I come down to the ground into our lived reality and that felt texture of a pattern. So we will be moving on Fridays into deeper explorations of not only what it means in the sky, but in our bodies, choices, relationships, and in the deeper architecture of life. So get your headphones, put your feet up, and enjoy this reflection with me. We've arrived at dark moon again, the end of the Gemini lunation cycle. We're in that liminal space between the Gemini cycle and the Cancer lunation cycle. That liminal space where we can rest and listen to the silence. And before I say anything else, I want to begin with a little quiet, because before we find the words, there's often a silence. It's not an empty silence. It's a silence full of the things we've not yet been able to say, the thoughts we've swallowed, the truths we've edited, the grief we've carried privately, the secrets that we've kept, the stories that we've learned to tell ourselves in order to belong, stay safe, and to avoid being too much. And I've been thinking about the voice a great deal this week. Last week, I sat in a conversation on Nicola Duffel's poetry with Jessie Rado. It's her collection over there on the portal. And we were led through a beautiful practice around voice, sound, singing, our bodies, and the place from which our truest voice emanates from. It was such a tenderly held space, and I found it so very deeply moving. There was something about taking the voice out of the head and bringing it into the body. The voice not as an opinion or an argument or a performance, but voice as breath, vibration, as a sound that begins somewhere deeper than the mind. And that all felt so synchronistic, because this whole lunation cycle began with the new moon in Gemini. And I've been talking all month about language in a narrative, the stories we tell, the stories that are told about us, and the larger narratives that shape the collective field. So coming to the end of this lunar cycle through a practice of voice felt so significant to me. Sometimes our truest voice doesn't arrive as a perfectly formed sentence. It arrives to us sometimes with a tightness in the throat, a hum, as tears, as a sense that something inside us has been waiting a very long time to be heard. And from there, I found myself thinking about Lilith, both the Lilith from myth and Black Moon Lilith. Astrologically, Black Moon Lilith isn't a planet, but a calculated point. The moon's apogee, the place where the moon is furthest from Earth. On the 10th of July, today, Black Moon Lilith is at 22 degrees of Sagittarius, and it's in a whole sign trine to Jupiter in Leo, and Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius. Sagittarius draws us towards the stories we believe, the truths that we seek, and the meaning we make from experience. Jupiter in Leo brings questions of dignity, creative courage, and the right to take up space. So there's something supportive here, and that's not necessarily easy, but it's strengthening, and it's about allowing the voice to come from a deeper sense of integrity. So we're not speaking simply to be heard, but choosing the words, the stories and values that return us to our own authority. Now, Lilith is a figure who's gathered many stories around her over the time. She appears in different forms across ancient Near Eastern traditions, Jewish folklore, Kabbalistic thought, art, literature, and much later, the feminist reimaginings. But many people know her through the latest story that she was Adam's first wife. In that story, Lilith is made from the same earth as Adam. She's not made afterwards from his body. She's not created to be a secondary to him. And when Adam expects her to submit to him, she refuses. She leaves. And that's the point in the story that holds so much symbolic power. Lilith becomes the figure who wouldn't consent to a relationship built on hierarchy. She becomes the woman who'll not agree to become smaller in order to remain acceptable. And as so often happens in myth and culture and the stories society tell about women, that refusal is not simply allowed to stand. She's demonized and becomes dangerous. She's cast as seductive, destructive, wild, unnatural, threatening. In Demetra George's book, Mysteries of the Dark Moon, she writes about Lilith as carrying the shadow projection placed upon defiant women. The women who'll not submit, who won't be contained, who won't become palatable in order to belong. And I think this is why Lilith still speaks so powerfully. She's not just a simple heroine, and not every aspect of her myth needs to be made beautiful or easy. She speaks powerfully because she gives symbolic form to something that many people recognised, that cost of saying no, of refusing the role that's been assigned to you, the cost of speaking from a place that others would rather silence. Lilith is often spoken about in terms of sexuality, autonomy, and the wild feminine, but tonight I'm thinking about her particularly in relation to voice. And it's that voice that says, this is not right for me. I do not consent. I will not continue to repeat a story that harms me or others. It's that voice that says, I'm not here to make myself smaller so that you can remain comfortable. And this is not always a loud voice. There's a great deal of pressure now to find your voice, as though voice always means speaking publicly, being visible, making declarations, taking up space in a very overt way. But sometimes our voice begins much more quietly than that. It can be that private moment when you stop agreeing inwardly to something that has diminished you. It can be the boundary that you don't need to explain 10 times. It's deciding that you will no longer feed a familiar story about who you are. It can be telling the truth to one trusted person, or simply allowing yourself to know what you know. Voice isn't always something we raise. It's also the place from which we choose. And choice matters, because so much of what shapes us is not always obvious. We inherit stories from family, culture, gender, religion, education, politics, media. We inherit ideas about what it means to be good and lovable, to be successful, to stay safe, feminine, masculine, acceptable, desirable, sensible. And often we're not consciously choosing those stories. We're repeating them. We may be repeating a story of scarcity or fear, or one that says we mustn't take up too much space. It could be a story that tells us other people's needs always come first, or that says we're powerless in the face of institutions, systems, wealth, war, violence, or the apparent scale of the world's problems. And this is where the Lilith symbolism for me becomes so much larger than the individual. Lilith is not just asking, where have you been silent? She's also asking, whose story are you living inside? Whose voice is shaping your inner world? And where have you mistaken an inherited narrative for your own truth? Over the last month, I've been speaking a great deal about narrative, the stories that are repeated until they feel inevitable, the words that shape our sense of reality, the way fear can become a kind of spell over us. And personally, I think there is a spell at work when we are persuaded that we are too small to matter, that one person can't make a difference, that systems are too powerful, that the story has already been decided. Because when people remain isolated, when they carry their fear or grief alone, when they don't know that others are feeling something similar, power can appear absolute. But something profoundly changes when people begin to find a language together, when people witness one another, when someone says the things that others have been unable to say. It's when our voices gather together and a community begins to recognise that the pain or injustice they've been carrying privately is not only personal but shared. There's real power in that. And it's not a power of domination or overpowering someone else. It's that power that emerges when people stop being isolated from one another. It's when we lift one another up, help one another find words, when we make room for the truth of another person's experience without trying to silence, fix, or diminish it. And perhaps that's one of the gifts of the portal space and spaces like it. We're not there to manufacture a voice. We're there to create enough safety that the voice which is already present can begin to emerge. So as we move towards the Cancer new moon, I've also been thinking about Demeter, the myth of Demeter, because Lilith and Demeter hold two very different but deeply connected forms of refusal. Lilith refuses to submit to a hierarchy that denies her equality. Demeter refuses to quietly accept the loss of her daughter. She refuses to simply endure it. She doesn't acquiesce to, this is the way things are, so I must carry on as though nothing has happened. Her grief changes the world. She withdraws her blessing from the earth, and in doing so, she makes visible what has been taken, what has been violated, and what has been ignored. Demeter is often reduced to the image of a soft, nurturing mother, but she's not only that. She's the great mother who knows what must be protected for life to continue. She knows the cost of separation and that grief is not a private inconvenience. She knows that when something precious has been taken, there must be a reckoning. So perhaps Lilith and Demeter belong together at this threshold. Lilith guards the boundary of the self. Demeter guards what allows life to continue. Lilith asks us, where have you given away your authority? Whilst Demeter is asking what must be protected, nourished and named if life is to flourish. And those are the Cancer new moon questions. Cancer is often spoken about in terms of home, family, memory, belonging, emotional life, but at its deepest level, Cancer asks us about the conditions that allow life to be held. What do we need in order to feel safe enough to be real? What needs to be sheltered and protected and tended? What is it that's been exiled from the inner home? And what have we learned to push away because it was too inconvenient, too emotional, disruptive, or too difficult for the world around us to receive? The dark moon is a good place to sit with these questions. We're not there at that new beginning, that new cycle. We're in a pause before it, the place where the old story is composting, the place where we listen beneath the surface. And perhaps this weekend, rather than asking yourself what you need to do next, you might ask yourself something much gentler. What narrative about myself am I ready to stop feeding? Where have I confused silence with safety, and where have I learned that speaking is dangerous? What is that truth that needs to be first heard in a safe place before it can become a fuller voice? And perhaps this is the real work of voice, not just to speak loudly, but to listen more deeply to our bodies, to the grief, to the stories that have travelled through family, ancestors, culture and memory. To listen to the voices that have been pushed to the edge of the village, and then slowly to decide which stories we're willing to continue carrying. As we approach the Cancer new moon, we don't have to rush into a new narrative. We can begin just by listening. We can listen to the symbol of Lilith and Demeter by asking ourselves, what have we been told that we must not say? And what must be protected so that life can continue? And the dark moon is asking us what is waiting quietly in the darkness to be heard. This is what I have for you. These are my thoughts over the month. And if the reflection has opened something for you, you're very welcome to join me over at the portal. I continue to explore these themes through myth, symbol, astrology and shared reflection, and where you can find the most extraordinary, both free and paid collections. And that is what I have for you. Thank you for being here. And I'll be back on Monday with the broader picture of the sky. And until then, I invite you to be tender with yourselves. Be honest with what is surfacing and listen carefully for what is alive at depth. Have a restful weekend. And I will see you on the next one.